Vissarionovich Dukashvili, later known as Joseph Stalin, was born on December 18, 1879, in a Russian peasant village named Gory. Now, this city is found in Georgia. The other village children treat him cruelly, instilling him in a sense of inferiority. Because of this, Joseph began a quest of greatness and respect. In 1885, Joseph came in contact with Mesem-Dasi, a secret organization that supported Georgian independence from Russia. Some of the members were socialists who introduced him to the writings of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin. Joseph joined the group in 1898 while he was in a seminary school, which he excelled until a year later when he left. In 1909, he joined the Social Democratic Labour Party and worked full-time for the revolutionary movement. In 1908, he was arrested for coordinating a labor strike and exiled to Siberia. After escaping from his exile in 1905, the Tsar secret police identified Stalin as an outlaw because Stalin was good at organizing strikes, meetings, and revolutions. He was allowed to get the general secretary position in the Communist Party. Thus, he got to control the group's assignments, and this way he gained control rapidly. In 1924, after the death of Lenin, Stalin planned to destroy the old party leadership to get total control. In the late 1920s, he seized the lands and reversed the Bolshevik agrarian policy, reducing the peasants back to serfs. Also, he set the rapid reindustrialization that was successful at first but took millions of lives. Any resistance was met with swift and lethal response. Millions of people were exiled to the labor camps of the Gulag or were executed.
What is Stalinism? Stalinism is this dictator's method of rule or policies associated with a regime of terror and a totalitarian rule. But what does this mean? During Stalin's leadership, he centralized all power so he could have control of everything. Just him, nobody else. It is said to be a regime of terror because he punished anyone who opposed or who he thought was an enemy, even though they weren't. Its goal was to accomplish socialism in one country. That meant that a classless society could be built in the Soviet Union. To achieve this, Stalin launched a program of rapid industrial development, causing a rapid collectivization of agriculture. Also, he emphasized heavy industrialization to secure Russia's future economic freedom from its capitalist neighbors.
Before the start of World War II in September 1st, 1939, Russia, or as it was named back then, the Soviet Union, had signed an agreement with Germany in an attempt to avoid a total war. This was a Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed on August 24, 1939. But this was in vain, as on June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, which was the biggest invasion force in the history of men. In the beginning, German advances forced Stalin to order Soviet troops to retreat and use scorched earth tactics. By 1943, the URSS had already lost 5 million soldiers in battle, as well as many millions of civilian lives. The German advance finally stopped with the Battle of Stalingrad, which lasted from July 17, 1942 to February 2, 1943. This was a turning point in World War II. Soviet armies were now marching towards Germany and finally ended the war alongside the Allies in the Battle of Berlin. All in all, the actions of the Soviet Union under Stalin's command were of vital importance in defeating the Axis powers. But this also came at an inhumane cost for the Soviets, as they were the nation that suffered the most losses of all the Allies. An estimated 26 million people died, of which 11 million were soldiers.
Now let's talk about human rights violations. During Joseph Stalin's government, the Soviet Union suffered an impressive amount of human rights violations. Stalin, alongside his cabinet, he had to be really strict in order to maintain control over the population and for Russia to achieve its objective. to become a world power. This objective could only be achieved with absolute control, also known as totalitarianism. As I just mentioned, the Soviet Union and human rights, well, these two things didn't really get along. Therefore, the human rights were often violated. An example could be during the Great Purge. The Great Purge was a process that Russia underwent thanks to Joseph Stalin. This purge was basically Stalin getting rid of who he thought was his opposition or his actual opposition. The purge happened in the 1930s, and most of the human rights, well, they were violated. Just to begin with, we could mention Articles number 10 and 11. These articles state that everyone has the right to an impartial trial and how no heavier penalty than the one applicable should be imposed. In the beginning of the purge, Stalin, he got rid of the old Bolsheviks. The old Bolsheviks, they were sentenced to a trial they would clearly lose because the government, well, it was against them. They were later on executed or sent to labor camps in Siberia, from which they never returned. These were some violations of Articles number 11 and number 9. Article number 9 states that you cannot be exiled from your country, or from any place in fact. An example of someone who suffered from the purge is Nikolai Yezhov. Yezhov was an old Bolshevik who suffered, as I just mentioned, the consequences of the purge. Yezhov had an important charge in the Soviet Union, but Stalin, he wanted to get rid of him, and so he started to downgrade Yezhov from his range gradually, to the point Nikolai Yezhov was no longer relevant in the country. Then Yezhov was sent to prison without having a trial and an opportunity to defend his case. Later on, after going to prison, Yezhov was murdered. You could say the government tried to get rid of Yezhov's existence, and this can be seen on these pictures. And thus, those were some examples of the violations of human rights.
When Stalin died in 1953, the end of an era, both in the Soviet Union and the world, was marked. Stalin didn't have a successor, and no single figure emerged immediately. Instead, a protest took place, and from the struggle, Nikita Khrushchev became the leader and generated a genuine, popular support by prompting more consumer industries, better pensions, and freedom of thousands of political prisoners from Stalin gulags. He also began a process named de-Stalinization. The face and name of the old leader were removed from propaganda, buildings, and even cities, like in the case of Stalingrad, which renamed Volgograd. In the following years, he spread into Africa and Latin America, like with Cuba and Fidel Castro and the Cold War.